World War II came to an end with a surrender approved by the Emperor of Japan and broadcast by him on the radio on August 15, 1945. But did you know that just a few hours before that broadcast was made, the end of the war was at serious risk of being different because of an attempted coup d'etat? Want to know how that happened? Stay with us. It's 2025, and exactly 80 years ago, World War II came to an end. Do you want to know how all of this happened in detail? Because the War Room created a very important person WhatsApp group, where every day I'm posting interesting facts about the last days of World War II. This is a very fun and interesting way to learn about all the events that led to the end of the war. To join this group, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. Join our group and be part of this story. I'll be waiting for you there. This whole story begins on July 26, 1945. Because after 10 days of conference, the three great Allied leaders reached an understanding. They reached an agreement on how to pressure Japan to surrender. The result of these talks was the Potsdam Declaration, a document that left no doubts. It clearly told the Japanese, surrender now or face the consequences. Total obliteration. This total obliteration actually meant the atomic bomb, which had already been successfully tested in the New Mexico desert at the Trinity test site. If you want to know more details, just click on our video. Right here, okay? This statement was broadcast on open radio, and once it was picked up by Japanese stations, it was translated and delivered to Emperor Hirohito by the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Shigenori. Togo read the statement to Hirohito, and when the emperor asked for his opinion on the text, Togo said he thought the conditions presented were harsh, but that Japan would hardly be able to get anything better. So Hirohito turned to Togo and said, "The thing is, just that conversation alone wouldn't result in Japan's surrender, because the country wasn't simply waiting for an Allied demand to surrender. The Japanese leaders had a very solid plan for the following months, and this plan was called Operation Ketsu-go, and it was laid out in black and white. Let the Americans invade Japan, in other words. Let the Americans carry out a major amphibious landing on the main islands of the Japanese archipelago. Once the Americans were on the ground, the Japanese would do this. With them, they would send a massive wave of soldiers and armed civilians with whatever they could get their hands on. From firearms to bamboo spears, literally pieces of bamboo cut diagonally to make them sharp, so that every Japanese citizen could kill at least one American soldier. And the Japanese had formed a civilian force trained for this kind of operation, which reached up to 23 million people. The goal of this whole scheme wasn't really to try to defeat the American army militarily in the field, but rather to impose on them a gigantic number of casualties. A number of casualties that would make the American population back in the United States turn against the war and force their leaders to negotiate peace on terms a bit more favorable to Japan. And in the middle of all that, Japan was still counting on the hypothetical mediation of the Soviet Union as a force that would make both countries, Japan and the United States, sit at the negotiating table and arrange a mediated end to the war. And all these plans were approved and kept in operation by the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, also known as the Council of the Six Greats. Who were the Six Greats? These guys here, from left to right, we have Admiral Somo Toyoda, who was the Chief of Staff of the Imperial Navy. General Kureishi Kanami, the all-powerful Minister of War of Japan, or Minister of the Army, whichever you prefer, who at that moment was the most powerful figure in the country, right behind Emperor Hirohito himself. Because once the Imperial Japanese Navy was basically destroyed after the massive defeats in the battles of the Marianas and the Philippines, the Imperial Army remained largely intact, with its large contingents both in Japan and in China. Next, we had here General Yoshijiro Umezu, who was the chief of staff of the army, that is the second in command of the army, right behind the general. Then, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who had been elevated to the position of Prime Minister by Emperor Hirohito himself, with the secret mission of leading Japan toward a negotiated peace. Then we have Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who was the commander of the Navy or Minister of the Navy, and finally Japan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Shigenori Togo. These first three military men here were in favor of continuing the war. They wanted the execution of Operation Ketsu-go, just as the plan had been established. But the last three, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Minister of the Navy, were in favor of a surrender, negotiation as soon as possible to spare Japan from further destruction. It's important to point out that even Prime Minister Suzuki's group was not in favor of an unconditional surrender. They at least wanted to keep the emperor and the kokutai, that is, the imperial system of power, in place. The council's plans would be put to the test on August 6, 1945, when the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, and especially on August 9, when the second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. To these two cataclysms, which made the Japanese military leaders realize that the Americans now had a weapon that was basically capable of destroying an entire city with the attack of a single aircraft. Added to this is the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which ends up stabbing Operation Ketsu-go in the back. Since Japan could no longer count on its great mediator, the Soviet Union. On that sorrowful day, August 9, 1945, shortly after 2 p.m., the Council of the Six Greats met. And once again, after the news of the second atomic bomb and also the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was brought to the table, the Council remained split down the middle, with the three members on the left wanting to continue the war, and the three members on the right wanting immediate peace. To clarify for you, the Council could only decide on surrender with a unanimous decision, but Prime Minister Suzuki could no longer wait after the cataclysms of that day. So he called an emergency council meeting once again for midnight on that night of August 9th to 10th. And this time, the council once again remained divided, split down the middle. But Suzuki, as this painting here shows, stood up and did something unimaginable. He asked the emperor for his personal opinion, his casting vote, something the emperor had never done before, having acted until then as a mere observer of the council's discussions. Then, when asked about his personal opinion, Hirohito solemnly says that the country can no longer endure that punishment, and that it should respond with a gesture of peace to the United States. Therefore, Minister Togo quickly drafts a letter requesting the opening of peace negotiations with a single demand: the maintenance of the emperor in his position of power. The Japanese used their diplomatic channels with Switzerland to get the message to the United States. And there, the American leaders analyzed the Japanese demands and composed their response, sending it back. At midnight between August 11 and 12, the American response, which reaches the Japanese on the morning of the 12th, says that after the surrender, the Allied Occupation Authority will be the highest authority in the country, and that every Japanese institution should answer to it, and that the future form of government of Japan will be decided by the Japanese people's own choice. While that American response had not yet arrived, the military at the Ministry of War were already quite nervous. And although the Ministry of Foreign Affairs viewed the American response with a caveat, saying that it represented a restriction of Japanese sovereignty, but that the terms were overall acceptable. The people at the Ministry of War basically saw the American terms as a declaration of slavery for the Japanese people. In the general's view, the American response did not preserve the kokutai, that is, the Japanese imperial system, which had been in place for more than 2,000 years. And at that moment, General Hanami, here on the left in the photo, was the most wanted figure in Japan. And at 10 p.m. that day, a secret meeting with him took place. At this meeting, a group of senior officers mainly composed of Major Kenji Hatanaka, Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shizaki, and Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takeshita, who was actually General Hanami's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Misataka Ida, and Colonel Okikatsu Arao. They showed themselves to be extremely dissatisfied with the actions of the current government and asked Hanami to take action. They wanted Hanami to arrest the government leaders and ensure the continuation of Japan's war. And, although personally dissatisfied with the decision of the Japanese government, Hanami actually appeared indecisive in front of the nervous officers gathered before him. Even without a firm response from the Minister of War, Major Hatanaka spends the entire day of August 13 recruiting more supporters for his attempted coup d'etat. To arrest the Japanese leaders and prevent the country from accepting surrender to the United States. Extremely nervous about the situation developing around him, Hanami goes to an imperial conference, which takes place at 11 p.m. on the 13th. And at this imperial conference, it is finally and formally accepted that Japan will, in fact, accept the surrender. Still upset with the outcome of the meeting, General Kurashika Hanami will then have 3 encounters that will be decisive for the course of history. The first of them is with General Shigeru Meizo, his chief of staff. In a room behind closed doors, inside, Hanami asks Meizo what he thinks about the possibility of a coup d'etat to prevent the continuation of the surrender. Meizo looks at Hanami and says that there is no hope left, and all they have to do at that moment is follow the orders that come from the emperor himself. Hanami's second meeting is with Colonel Saburo Hayashi, who commanded a large aviation group in the actions in Tokyo. He discusses with Hayashi the possibility of attacking the American fleet, which is approaching Japan for the surrender negotiations. But Hayashi categorically protests against this possibility. He also tells him that the presence of this American fleet was based on mere rumors and that nothing had been confirmed yet. Finally, Hanami's third and last meeting is with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takeshita, who listens to Hanami and then gives him 2 options. The first would be to resign and destabilize the government platform, therefore delaying any action related to surrender. The second, and more drastic, is to join the coup that was being formed and arrest the entire government to prevent the surrender from being announced. Hanami responds by saying that his resignation would be useless at that point, and the possibility of joining the coup would still require a lot of reflection from him, together with his advisors at the Ministry of War. On the morning of August 14th, the highest authorities of the Imperial Japanese Army gather at the Ministry of War, and many of these officers are very nervous about how events are unfolding. Many of them even want to get involved in a coup attempt to prevent Japan's surrender. But then, the Deputy Chief of Army Staff, General Wakamatsu, suggests that they all sign a document in which they all commit to obeying the emperor's orders, no matter what happens. General Kurashika Hanami himself and his chief of staff, Yoshijiro Umesu, sign this document, but also Marshal Hajime Sugiyama, commander of the 1st Area Army, and Marshal Shunroku Hata, commander of the 2nd Area Army. who in fact was in Hiroshima on August 6 and survived the nuclear explosion in the city. Finally, to ensure that the Army Air Force would also not resist the surrender procedures, General Masakazu Kawabe was called, who signed on behalf of the Army Air Forces. Meanwhile, in the Imperial Palace of Tokyo, the final text of the surrender announcement was completed at 7 p.m., and it was passed on to the official court calligrapher, so it could finally be delivered to Emperor Hirohito to be read. But the atmosphere surrounding these events was one of pure tension, because it was known inside the palace that many high-ranking army officers were unhappy with what was happening, and something really could happen at any moment. At 9:30 p.m. that night, the 2nd Regiment of the Imperial Guards arrived at the palace to reinforce the security of the place, and to spend that night, which everyone already felt would be quite tense. Soon after the 2nd Regiment arrived at the palace, Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shizaki, one of the conspirators, convinces the commander of the 2nd Regiment that the coup was supported by both General Hanami and General Umezo, and therefore it had the support of the entire army. And because of that, the commander of the 2nd Regiment begins to surround the palace and prevent anyone outside from entering. Meanwhile, Major Hatanaka goes to the office of General Shizuichi Tanaka, who was the commander of the Eastern District Army, and tries to convince General Tanaka to join the coup. However, he is unsuccessful, and General Tanaka orders him to go home immediately, an order that Hatanaka does not obey. He returns to the Imperial Palace. At 11 p.m., a recording team from Nippon Hoso Kyokai Radio goes to the palace and records Emperor Hirohito reading Japan's surrender declaration. Once it's ready, the recording is then hidden in a safe located below the Empress of Japan's secretary's office, inside the palace. At 1 o'clock in the morning in August 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takeshita visits his brother-in-law, General Hanami, and finds him awake, just out of a bath and very focused, writing his own will. In that text, General Hanami says he could not bear the weight of his sins, and to this day historians debate what those sins might have been. Was it the Japanese defeat, the Pacific War, or was it Hanami's involvement in the ongoing coup d'etat? Soon after, Hanami told Takeshita, "I am going to commit seppuku." I couldn't bear to hear the emperor's voice announcing the surrender at 1:15 in the morning. Major Hatanaka then closes the siege around the palace, and together with Lieutenant Colonel Shizaki, heads to the office of the commander of the 1st Imperial Guard Division. The commander of the 1st Imperial Guard Division is General Takeshi Mori, and at that moment, Mori was meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Mishinori Shinaishi. When confronted by Hatanaka, Mori listens to the explanations of the two coup plotters and refuses to join the coup. Mori's refusal makes Shizaki extremely nervous, causing him to draw his samurai sword. Shizaki then moves to deliver a fatal blow to Mori, but Shinaishi steps in during the attack and is killed in the general's place. Just moments after this tragedy, however, Major Hatanaka draws his pistol and kills General Mori at point-blank range. Having carried out what would be the only 2 deaths that night, Hatanaka and Shizaki forge Mori's authorization on a document, causing the entire 1st Division of the Imperial Guards to then carry out Strategic Order number 854, which involves sealing off the Imperial Palace to, quote, protect the emperor. The coup plotters also cut almost all the telephone lines connecting the palace to the outside world, thus increasing the solidity of the occupation. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Hatanaka finally enters the Imperial Palace and begins searching for the recording of the surrender made by Hirohito. A few moments after that, Lieutenant Colonel Ida arrives at General Anami's house, and, realizing that Anami was about to perform the seppuku ritual, he told the general that he would also commit suicide along with him. But Anami surprisingly slaps Ida's face violently and tells Ida and Takeshita that only he would die that night, and he forbade them from performing seppuku, and that their mission from that moment on would be to rebuild Japan after the war. Meanwhile, a second group of coup officers, led by Captain Takeo Sasaki, is heading to Yokohama to assassinate Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki. However, Suzuki is warned, moments before the coup officers arrive at his house, that he is being hunted and escapes from the residence. The coup officers then find Suzuki's house empty and set the entire property on fire. Until the end of August 1945, Kantaro Suzuki remains under constant protection by the Japanese police and is moved to a different residence every night. In the middle of the night, Major Hatanaka is searching the entire imperial palace for the recordings he can't find, as well as for people who could lead him to the recording. He is particularly looking for Koichi Kido, who is the Lord Keeper of the Japanese Emperor's Privy Seal, and the person who would definitely know the whereabouts of the recording. However, Kido is also hiding in a secret air raid shelter beneath the palace, and he won't be found by Hatanaka. A little after that, Lieutenant Colonel Ida returns to the palace, and, already seeing that there is no hope of support for the coup, he asks Hatanaka to give up his intentions and leave the palace. But at that moment, Hatanaka is determined to go to the end at any cost, and he tells him that he wants at least 10 minutes on Nippon Hoso Kyokai radio to be able to speak to the population about his reasons for carrying out a coup d'etat. It is at that moment that the colonel commander of the 2nd Regiment of Imperial Guards realizes that he has been deceived, and he starts changing his men's orders against the coup group. At 5 a.m., Hatanaka storms into the Nippon Hoso Kyokai radio broadcast studio, brandishing his pistol and making demands. Put on the air to speak to the Japanese population. At 5:30 a.m., General Hanami finally commits ritual suicide, seppuku, and in this act he is assisted by his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Takeshita. With Hanami's death, the only major source of power in Japan that could support the coup ceases to exist with the first light of dawn on August 15. General Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, is informed that the imperial palace was indeed invaded by the coup plotters the previous night, and he heads there immediately. Arriving at the location, Tanaka uses his authority to halt the entire contingent of imperial guards and demands that the officers occupying the palace leave immediately. Tanaka's order puts an end to the coup attempt, which would go down in history as the Kyujou incident, with Kyujou being the Japanese name for the imperial palace. And so, at 8 in the morning, it is all over. It was exactly at 8 in the morning that Major Tanaka, riding a motorcycle, left the palace, followed by Colonel Shizaki, who left the palace on horseback. The two of them then traveled through several streets of the capital, Tokyo, handing out pamphlets that explained to the population the reasons behind their actions. And at 11 in the morning, just 60 minutes before Hirohito's public announcement was broadcast, Major Tanaka took his pistol, aimed it at his head, and fired, ending his own life. Colonel Shizaki stabbed himself with his dagger, but also took his own life with a pistol shot. And, at noon, as planned, Hirohito's message echoed over the radio throughout Japan, and for the first time, the Japanese people heard the voice of their sovereign. At that very moment of deep national sorrow, Japan surrendered for the first time in its history. In one of Major Tanaka's jacket pockets, his last poem was found, which said, "I have nothing to regret now that the dark clouds have disappeared from the emperor's reign." And despite the deaths of the two main people involved in the conspiracy, the other three leaders had very different fates. But the wealthy Takeshita continued his military career, reaching the rank of general in Japan's ground self-defense forces in the 1950s. Meanwhile, Masataka Ida faced a court-martial, but he ended up being acquitted because he reportedly regretted the coup during its execution and asked Hatanaka to give up the conspiracy. After the war, he ended up becoming the director of Dentsu, a major Japanese advertising agency headquartered in Tokyo. Colonel Arao, on the other hand, was even accused of war crimes related to the mistreatment of American prisoners of war on the so-called hell ships during the crossing of the Pacific to the Japanese islands. But in the end, he was never prosecuted and even worked on the demobilization commission of the Japanese armed forces in the immediate post-war period. And in this way, the attempted coup d'etat was thwarted and Japan surrendered 80 years ago. But tell me, did you already know the whole story behind Japan's last days in World War II? Do you think the coup attempt had a chance of success and could have changed the outcome of the war? Tell us in the comments. If you like this video, then share it with your friends and also give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here and thank you again for watching. And here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.